Hello and welcome to the Shed Sounds Media YouTube channel. My name is Ian Beabout, and today we will be taking a look at the classic 1973 album from Genesis, Genesis Live. Now, this was the first of 5 live albums released during the band's lifetime, followed by Seconds Out in 1978, Three Sides Live in 1982, and there was a pair of live albums released in the early 90s called The Way We Walk Volume 1 and The Way We Walk Volume 2. Now, I've never heard those final 2 albums, which were recorded on the 1986 Invisible Touch tour, but I have heard this one, Seconds Out, and also Three Sides Live. Now, for many fans, this is the band's greatest live recording. I have to confess, I'm not the biggest fan of live albums. I like the sound better of studio albums because studio albums are often much cleaner sounding. I enjoy overdubs and hearing creativity in the studio and things coming together. Oftentimes, live albums are very roughly recorded. Sometimes the performances aren't that great, and especially in the 70s, live albums could feel like they were just fulfilling a contract. Like so many albums had to be delivered at a certain time. And so, let's just put out basically a greatest hits collection in front of an audience. This album, I think, somewhat falls into that latter category, at least from the band's perspective, because the original idea was that it was meant to buy the band some time to work on and finish the Selling England by the Pound album, which is one of my absolute favorites. And this being a collection of recordings from the previous tour, the Foxtrot tour in 1972, meant that when it did come out, and it came out after Selling England by the Pound, it kind of looked like it was a bit out of date. And this is something that frustrated Peter Gabriel especially. That being said, I do think that while it's not the best sounding album from a recording perspective, it's not particularly recorded that well, it does contain a number of very spirited performances from the classic 5-man Genesis lineup, which is, of course, Peter Gabriel on vocals and flute, Steve Hackett on guitar, Tony Banks on keyboards and some guitar as well, Mike Rutherford on bass and some 12-string and different guitars, and finally, of course, Phil Collins on drums. What you have here are 5 tracks, 2 of which originated from the Foxtrot album, and they are Watcher of the Skies and Get 'Em Out by Friday. 2 songs from the Nursery Crime album, The Return of the Giant Hogweed and Musical Box, and finally The Knife, which was originally released on the Trespass album in 1970. Since this album recently reached its 51st anniversary, I believe it came out on July 20th of 1973, I thought it was a good time to talk about it. And when I did my Genesis reappraisal last month, this was actually one of the last albums that I bought. So it is very fresh in my mind, and I've listened to it fairly recently. So right off the bat, you have Watcher of the Skies, which I love as an opener because it sets this very gothic, atmospheric hammer horror vibe. It kind of sets the tone for everything that follows. And when listening to it, I can definitely imagine this in a theatrical setting. It helps that I've seen the footage from this era with Peter Gabriel with the UV makeup and the Batwing headpiece and the long flowing cape. But I do love this as an atmosphere and a way to open the record. It's a very complex piece. With a lot of very unusual staccato rhythms. Everybody in the band is playing the same thing. It's kind of a bit like 21st Century Schizoid Man by King Crimson in that regard. However, I do think that Watcher of the Skies is the one track on this live album that isn't as good as the studio version. I think the studio version on the Foxtrot album is absolutely incredible, and it is the best version of the song. And I think the band would probably agree. I think they've gone on record as saying that they never quite got it right live. And to my ears, this rendition of it is a little under tempo compared to the studio recording. So I find the studio recording just a little bit more exciting. However, when we get 'Em Out by Friday, things pick up considerably. And I think that this is where this album starts to be better than the studio counterparts. And for instance, a song like "Get 'Em Out by Friday" is a classic example of a Genesis track where there's too many words. And this isn't me saying this as a critic. This is me kind of repeating what the band have said on a number of occasions about songs like "Harold the Barrel," "The Battle of Epping Forest," "Robbery, Assault, and Battery," or even "All in a Mouse's Night." These are all songs that are character pieces, but as songs, they tend to have too many words, and they have this problem of trying to fit all of them in a musically satisfying way. However, I do think that live, "Get 'Em Out by Friday" works a little bit better, especially in the vocal delivery, with Peter Gabriel having a chance to make these characters much more musical, and he seems like he does a better job of fitting the words in over the music. This also has some wonderful keyboard playing from Tony Banks, some wonderful leads from Steve Hackett, and some great just growling bass work from Mike Rutherford. We move on to "The Return of the Giant Hogweed," which is the first of 2 songs from the Nursery Crime album. Now, this might be a controversial opinion, but I actually don't like the Nursery Crime album as well as some of the other albums from that era. I even like Trespass better. Nursery Crime has a lot of great ideas, but it's not well recorded. It's not well mixed, and it's kind of poorly produced, in my opinion. And there's also this sense that you've got 2 new guys, you got some new blood in the band, and they're still kind of figuring out where they fit within the 5-man balance. By the time you get to a year later when they recorded this, I feel like Steve Hackett and Phil Collins were much better implemented within the band and much more confident. And this makes a song like "The Return of the Giant Hogweed" really sing. And it's very compelling. And I would argue that since this track is from a different performance than the others, it's also better recorded than many of the other tracks on the album. And you notice this, it's not so much during the quieter parts, but when the band gets really heavy and raucous, I feel like this recording has a tendency to get a bit chaotic. But I think that "Giant Hogweed" is maybe the exception to this rule. And especially when you get to the conclusion of this track, which is very Black Sabbath-y and dark sounding. I'm no music theory nerd, but it really does sound like they're playing tritones. It's indescribably heavy. And kind of the amazing thing about this is that a lot of the riffing from this band comes from the keyboard and bass. And you find Steve Hackett's contributions are much less of a bluesy nature as many guitar players, especially of the prog genre, could be. He's coming from somewhere completely different, and oftentimes his leads are so creative and so different from what anybody else was playing at that time that you don't always necessarily recognize it as guitar at first. You kind of think, what is that sound? It sounds like alien communications. But I think that this is the genius of what Steve Hackett brought. You definitely hear that even more later on in a track like "The Musical Box," where he has a chance to really stretch out and play some cool leads. This is the best version of "The Musical Box" for my money. It really soars. You can really feel the emotion of it. Great soloing from Tony Banks when he has his chance to kind of dig in. And when you get to that finale, you can really feel an emotional peak. It really reaches its height here, and it really cements itself as an all-time classic Genesis tune in my mind when you hear it performed live. We reach what is my favorite song on this album, and that's "The Knife." I know that "The Knife" is a really popular song among fans, especially as a live track. But when it appeared on the Trespass album in 1970, I always kind of felt like it was buzzkill on that album. It's got this chill vibe. And whenever "The Knife" comes on, it feels so different from what came before on that album, that there's a part of me that's kind of let down. However, on this album, Genesis Live, we have quite a lot of heavy stuff, driving stuff over the previous 4 tracks, and it feels much more a part of the piece. I also think that the addition of Phil Collins and Steve Hackett really elevates this song beyond what the studio version was, because there was always that feeling for me with the original version that the pastoral Genesis were pushing themselves a little bit too far out of their comfort zone yet. And some of the drumming is just a little bit wonky on that original version. Not so on this version. Phil Collins drives this song, especially during the last third or so. He really brings an aggression to this track, and I love it when he's hitting the whistle, because that's something else that kind of ramps up the energy, and it brings this live album, to a thrilling conclusion that they wanted to do on Trespass, but I think they really pull it off here, and it kind of cements it as an all-time classic Genesis tune. So back to the original question: is Genesis Live the best Genesis live recording? I don't know. As great as Genesis Live is, it could have been better. And the original plan was to include Supper's Ready on this, and to expand it to a double record. And I think had Supper's Ready been included on the album, it would be a pretty easy choice for me. 6 years later, with the release of Seconds Out, you do get a complete recording of Supper's Ready. And it's glorious. It's a wonderful version. Is it as quirky as the Peter Gabriel era? No. And sometimes Phil Collins' vocals don't quite work for me on the Seconds Out album. But that one's kind of easy for me to point to as the greatest Genesis live album, because it is a double, it is expansive, and I feel like it's a better overview of what 70s Genesis were all about. And of course, it's the last album before Steve Hackett jumped ship. I feel historically maybe more inclined to vote for Seconds Out. I do think this is an excellent album. It's not a perfect album. Again, there's some recording issues and other things going on, and it should have had Supper's Ready on it, I think. But as a snapshot of the Peter Gabriel era, I think it's good, and it could even serve as a nice introduction to the band, because it is kind of a highlights album, and it could be something to hand to somebody that would encourage them to go back and explore the first couple of albums. All right, so that's my review of Genesis Live, which turned 51 about a week ago, so I'm a little bit late in celebrating this. What are your thoughts on Genesis Live? Is this the best Genesis Live record? You tell me below in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you like The Way We Walk, the double album that I've never heard, let me know. Maybe I should check that one out too, and kind of throw it in to the ring and see how it compares. Don't forget that if you enjoyed this video, to leave it a like. And also don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because I hope to cover more classic progressive music. Also, if you would like to support the channel with a donation, there's a link in the description to my Amazon wish list. There's no Genesis stuff on there, but there are a number of other interesting things. And again, this is the best way to get me to cover something on the channel. If you see something on there that you'd like to hear me talk about, if you send it in as a gift or donation, there's a pretty good chance that I will find the time to talk about it and review it. All right, that's it for me, at least for now. But you will be seeing and hearing from me real soon. Bye-bye.